Just getting confirmation from Chris that our audio is fine and that we are live. And it's 11 a.m. my time. I'm not sure where it is your time, but we'll go ahead and get started. So welcome everyone to our 5th webinar in the Database Lifecycle Management series. I'm really excited to be talking about databases and continuous delivery today. This webinar is sponsored by ReadyRoll, which is a Visual Studio extension to help SQL Server database development, and Elizabeth will be talking a little bit more about that at the end of the webinar. Today's discussion, should your database be continuously delivered? So just a few housekeeping items before we get started. This webinar is being recorded and you'll get a link to it afterwards. We collected questions for you to ask Dave Farley directly about continuous delivery when you registered, but we really encourage you to ask questions throughout the discussion today. We hope to interject with any questions that you can think of to help get them answered. So we'll spend the first few minutes giving an introduction to Dave and Elizabeth, and then we'll start the panel discussion. So we'll have questions that we already asked, but again, feel free to ask your questions in the GoToWebinar panel. And at the end, a brief introduction to ReadyRoll. So Dave, could you tell us a little bit more about yourself? I recognize you as the author of Continuous Delivery book, but could you tell us some more about yourself?
Sure. Thank you for inviting me, and hello to everybody. My name is Dave Farley. I'm one of the authors of, as you say, the Continuous Delivery book that's kind of helped establish continuous delivery as part of the move to more agile approaches to looking at the whole life cycle of software development. I'm a software developer by training and profession. I've worked in a variety of different companies doing all sorts of different software. Over recent years, I've been working in the field of low latency finance industries on the whole. At the beginning of this year, I left full-time employment and became an independent consultant, and I now work for my own company, advising companies all around the world on how to adopt continuous delivery, how to, what it takes, coaching teams, those sorts of things. And the other thing that I'm also one of the authors of a thing called the Reactive Manifesto, which is about modern high-performance software architectures, and that's also part of the work that I do, is that I consult on that stuff as well. So kind of I talk about process, organizational structure and design, so I kind of cover a fairly broad spectrum of the software development space.
So we're so excited to have you here today to share all that expertise and all the experience you have from working with all these teams. Elizabeth, could you give us a quick introduction to yourself as well?
Absolutely. My name is Elizabeth Eyre. I've been a product manager with Redgate Software for about 7 years now, and most recently I've been doing research into the problems that companies are facing when trying to do continuous delivery database automation. And so right now I'm also working on the version controlling tools for the database, but most of my work has been trying to collect the stories from actual people out in the field and bring together what we see out there is working really well for them, and try to establish some good practice from that.
Great. Thank you guys so much. So Elizabeth, I wanted to hand it over to you to ask your questions of Dave and ask some of the questions we got from the attendees to learn more about continuous delivery and specifically about the database.
Thank you, Stephanie. I wonder if we can just start, Dave, with the question of what is continuous delivery and what is not continuous delivery. So some people will be pretty new to the topic here. If you could give us an introduction, that would be great.
Sure. So I see continuous delivery as a fairly holistic approach to software development. Fundamentally, what it's about is it's about optimizing the software development process for having an idea, getting that idea into the hands of our users in the form of working software, and seeing what they make of it. And what we do in continuous delivery processes is that we look at what it takes to make that process of having ideas and getting them into the hands of our users as efficient as we possibly can. Mm-hmm. That takes that tends to touch on most aspects of the software development process. it has implications for the way in which we organize our teams. It has implications for the technology choices that we make. It has implications for the architectural choices that we make in the ways that we structure our software, how we test it, how we deploy it into production. All of those things are kind of touched on if we want to really concentrate on making this process as efficient as we can. What it's not is it's not necessarily automatically releasing software into production after every change. That's something that's called continuous deployment, and there's a subtle difference there. So continuous deployment is a form of continuous delivery. Continuous delivery, though, is working in a way to ensure that your software is always in a releasable state, but the decision to release is a business decision. Most organizations that practice continuous delivery are on a spectrum somewhere in the region of releasing once every couple of weeks to releasing, in Amazon's case, once every 11.6 seconds. And that's generally the kind of span of time. But it's a business choice about what makes sense. Some organizations, it makes no sense to be releasing changes at the rate that Amazon does. For other organizations, releasing that frequently, every time something changes, makes perfect sense.
So what is so special about keeping things in a releasable state if you're not actually planning to release it?
It's about not being surprised. It's about making sure that we can work in a way where we find our errors quickly and we're able to respond efficiently when we find them. If I'm working, and I worked in one of my conference presentations, I have two examples of projects that I worked in. On one of those projects, the shortest time that it was a bank could release software into production was 103 days. If they went through all of their normal processes and so on to release software into production, it took them 103 days to validate that their software was ready to go and release it. If you're working in that way, that means that every release is going to be big and complex and fraught with risk. Another project that I worked in, our cycle time, as it's called, was 57 minutes. If we could make any change of any kind to our system, and if all of the tests pass, we would be ready to release it in 57 minutes. And when you've got a feedback cycle of that, it fundamentally changes your relationship with the software. It changes your relationship with ideas, with the cost, the overhead of having an idea and getting that before your users. It also means that you're more reactive. You can turn around these things more quickly, and you can respond to customer or business demand more efficiently.
Okay. So one question we had from Suresh is whether there's an alternative to continuous delivery. As in, if you want all these benefits, is there some other methodology out there that could get you to them?
If you want all of these benefits, then I think no. Clearly there are alternatives to continuous delivery. I am biased.
Continuous delivery.
Yeah, I am biased, and I think that they are not as good. I think that continuous delivery is the gold standard for software development process. It's the best way that we know how to do it at the moment, is my view.
Okay.
And some of the most successful companies in the world work this way. There's growing evidence that this kind of has a bottom line advantage to organizations. So organizations are making more money because they're working in this way and being reactive, because it changes their relationship with their customer base.
Well, that actually brings us to another question that I think is a really good one, that I think some people are wondering who's really doing this and what kind of customers have made it all the way to continuous delivery. Can you tell us who you've seen out there actually succeed fully with this, who's not necessarily the Amazons and the Etsys and the Facebooks?
Well, Amazon, Etsy, Facebook, Netflix, Spotify, those people do it. And the reason that we all know about them and that they are successful is because they write good software. So, there's a reason why those companies are successful. But there are other companies. So I've worked in various projects, some of at different levels of resolution of continuous delivery. Perhaps the best example in my career is at a company called LMAX, which is the London Multi-Asset Exchange. We were building a low latency FX trading exchange, and we did that from the ground up as a continuous delivery project. That was an enormously successful project. They've open source software. They have a fabulous reputation for the quality of their work. They've kind of published on all sorts of different topics, and I put that down to the kinds of lessons and approach that kind of come from that. I've also worked in other organisations that weren't starting with a blank sheet of paper, and they've moved in that direction too. So there are many organisations practicing this, many organisations that perhaps would surprise people. So the ING Bank in Holland is an organisation that's had a big project in switching to continuous delivery and seen big changes. SAP have been writing about the impact of continuous delivery on some of their teams. HP, the HP LaserJet team employed continuous delivery to manage and release the firmware for their printers. Organisations in all sorts of different business sectors. This isn't just about the big web companies. It's not just the Amazons, the Googles and Netflixes that do this. There are organisations across the board, and I believe that the reason for that is that this is a better way of creating software, and so it's a competitive advantage if you start employing this, whatever the nature of your business.
Okay, well let's dive right into the controversial question at the center of this webinar. But what about the database? Should that be continuously delivered?
I believe that it should. In those organisations where I've worked, the database has absolutely been continuously delivered along with any other changes to our system.
Do you think the database is sort of a special object, though, for this? Is it different from the rest of software?
I don't really. I think there are some different technical challenges with dealing with databases. You have to approach that in a slightly different way and with a slightly different mindset, perhaps, to some other changes that you make to an executable product in production. But fundamentally, philosophically, I don't think there's any difference. I want to make sure that every change that I make has been evaluated as fully as I can before I put it in front of users. I want to make sure that it's well tested, and that testing is very efficient, and that means that it's highly automated. The database is very amenable to that kind of approach to software development, and so in that sense I don't think it's a special case.
Okay, well maybe we could talk a little bit about the concrete aspects of continuous delivery. So maybe talk a little bit about the pipeline and what that means in the database's case, what that looks like.
Certainly. So one of the kind of core ideas of continuous delivery is this idea of a deployment pipeline. The simplest way to picture this is to just imagine your process of releasing software, and imagine automating that so that it's as efficient as you can make it. And pretty much that's what a deployment pipeline is about. And the specific nature of a deployment pipeline will vary between projects, but there are kind of there are usually some fairly common touch points. So the pipeline probably starts at the point at which somebody commits a change that is destined for production. And the job of the pipeline from then on is to prove that that change is not fit to make it into production. We can never have enough tests to prove that this change is fit to make it into production, but if one test fails, we know it's not good enough and we should throw that release candidate away. So the change starts the journey, and it becomes, conceptually we treat it as a release candidate, and then we evaluate that release candidate, and as soon as we find that that release candidate is not fit, we discard it. So we'll be looking at doing all of the things that we would normally want to do, but we will be, because we want this to be repeatable, reliable and efficient, we will be automating all of those things and kind of minimizing the degree to which we'll be using human beings for for manual testing. So we're doing very high levels of automated testing, very high levels of automated deployment, configuration management, those sorts of things.
I guess I've always had the impression that continuous delivery and automation really go hand in hand. I mean, do you see them as being different things, or are they really?
No, I think you're right. I think automation is pretty much a fundamental component of continuous delivery. I guess it's if you had something ridiculously simple and you had it had one feature and that feature could be tested in 30 seconds by a human being, you could imagine doing continuous delivery with people. But as soon as you get much beyond that, people are too expensive and too inefficient and not reliable enough. Even in that circumstance, part way through I'd want to go for a cup of coffee and I'd probably blow the cycle time because I was going to the loo or something like that. And so there's there are things. Automation is great at repetition. People are not. People are great at being creative and inventive, and that we want to use. We want to amplify people's abilities to do those things, and we do that amplification by using computers for what they are wonderful at, and that's repetition. So we automate the hell out of our testing and deployments and configuration management in order to free people up to do creative things.
All right, so let's suppose that we're convinced and we're saying, yes, we're going to embark on this journey down towards continuous delivery. Can you give us a warning about what some of the common pitfalls are? What should we be looking out for?
I hope the way that I've described it so far that it sounds like a relatively simple idea. And at the level at which I've expressed it, it is a simple idea. The execution is really tough, though. This is a massive culture change for most organizations. It's a really, really big switch, and it leaks out. This is not, continuous delivery is not a process that you can get world class at and only do it within the confines of a development organization, a development team. It's going to spread. Continuous delivery and DevOps are often talked about hand in hand. And that's because this stuff leaks over into operations as well as into development. Continuous delivery and testing are often talked about hand in hand. That's because it leaks over into testing. But more than that, it leaks over into the way that businesses operate. If you're in a business and you can have an idea on a Monday, get it implemented on a Tuesday, see it on in production on a Wednesday, and decide whether it was a good idea or not, and have another idea, that changes the way your business works. It changes the way you prioritize work. It makes you more experimental as an organization. And that, too, is a big culture change. It requires different ways of working, different ways of collaborating. So the huge challenge for practicing continuous delivery is not really about the mechanics of it, the technology around it. It's about the people and the processes. It's about the way in which we collaborate, the way in which we organize our teams, the way in which we organize our businesses, the way in which creativity, ideas flow through our businesses and are executed. That's the nature of the change. If I am honest, I have not seen any organization go through that process of change and get good at it in under 3 years. This is a long-term strategy. This isn't a quick win.
Right. Well, that brings us to a question that Jonathan asked, which is this: my concern with all of this for databases, continuous delivery for databases, is that we'll spend more time setting it up and troubleshooting than we'll ever get back. So what kinds of benefits and ROI can he expect to get?
Well, the data, you can take this with a pinch of salt, but the data from projects, I'm not a big believer in project surveys, because it's not good science. It's the statistic. We don't have a sample set. Usually, we don't have a sample set that's big enough to really use statistics to our advantage. We can't establish a control. Your project's going to be different to my project, even if we're building the same thing. All of those things, and so it's not a very scientific test, but it's probably the best that we've got. And the data that we have from project experience is that projects that are run this way are quite significantly more efficient than projects that are not. So you can talk about, so on average, the rate at which people release software into production goes up by a factor of more than 8,000 times when you go through continuous delivery. And the rate at the rate at which defects are found once things make it into production drop by hundreds of times. So what you get is you get a trade-off. You get so I think you said it was Jonathan that asked this question. Jonathan is right in that you expend an awful lot of effort writing tests and evaluating your software before you release it, but you tend to spend almost no effort debugging problems after the fact because you don't see very many of those. The company that I referred to earlier, Elmax, we were in a production for more than a year before we had our first bug that a customer noticed. We had bugs in production, but we noticed them because our monitoring was good. We found lots and lots of bugs in testing before things got into production. As a result of that kind of change in the economics of software development, we end up doing different things. There's a great book on this subject called Agile for Large Organizations or something like that, and it's written by the HP. It's written by the HP people, the HP LaserJet. And HP team went through a very difficult time, and the interesting part, and they kind of evolved a continuous delivery approach to solving their problems. And the interesting part is that they kept data. So the same team doing the same kind of work, and they analysed where their effort went over time. And they increased their productivity by a factor of 20 by adopting continuous delivery. So when you're talking about those kinds of changes, that's not a small incremental step. That's a step change in the way in which organisations work, and so it changes the economics, as I said before, and so you change the sorts of things that you do. So you will spend more time writing tests. The HP team spent significantly more time writing tests and test automation and doing tooling, but they traded that off for all sorts of other things that they just stopped doing as a result.
So Dave, will we be able to share any of that data or any of those references after the call with the listeners? I mean, I think that's something that hard data would be really interesting for them to see.
Yes, by all means. I've got links to various surveys and analyses of these sorts of things, and I can point people. We can point people at the book that I'm mentioning because I think I got the title wrong.
Okay, well, we'll follow up with that then. But okay, so getting down to practical issues of doing this for databases, I mean, are there like common practical issues that people encounter when they say, okay, we kind of got this sorted out for applications, we understand this, how do we extend this to the database?
There are, and I think quite a lot of those are part of the message that I'm trying to convey is that this is quite a radical step. This is quite a significant change in the way in which you do work. And one of those things, so essentially what we're doing is that we're trying to say, let's start out with a blank sheet of paper. Let's assume that anything's on the table. Any advantage, if we want to get this kind of advantage, to give this kind of advantage to the organisations in which we work, then any changes on the table. So, we can restructure the team, we can re-architect our software, we can change the way that our processes work, and all those kinds of things. So if that's the case, then, it's going to challenge some of the things that we've taken as common patterns. I think one of the big deals in terms of databases, that ideas that are challenged by ideas like continuous delivery, is the idea of a database as an integration point. The idea of multiple applications using a database in order to share data between them. If you look at organizations that are mature in their application of continuous delivery, their software architecture tends not to look like that. They tend to be moving away from that. They tend to be moving more in the direction of microservice architectures and databases owned by specific parts of the system and dedicated to specific jobs. And that's a big change, I think, for many organizations.
So a lot of people out there obviously are in that position where the database is a central thing that many teams are using in many different ways. Does that mean these people are kind of ruled out from this?
No, I don't think so. But I think that if those organisations want to get some of the advantages that we're talking about, strategically they're probably looking at a re-architecting of their systems over time to start moving in that direction. Now, I've talked about this a few times now about kind of the long scale of this kind of change. That doesn't mean that you've got to wait for months or years before you see an advantage. It doesn't mean that you've got to have perfection in place before this is good. One of the advantages and one of the philosophies of continuous delivery and processes like it are to make changes in small steps and evaluate those changes and figure out what's working and what's not. And that includes moving an organization or a software architecture or a process from something that's perhaps less efficient to something that's more efficient. And so these small steps over time will bring advantages in their own right. And there are techniques that you can apply for taking a software architecture that's got a big shared database and figuring out how to start building some Chinese walls between aspects of that database, and then over time carving that off and sort of separating the concerns so that they're available to through a more tightly controlled scope within the architecture of the system. But it's a complex thing. It's not a simple step.
Sure, but we can apply the continuous delivery principles to the continuous delivery process itself and still see benefits all the way along the way. So even if you're doing it partially, you think you'll still get some benefits from that, kind of CD light?
Yeah, absolutely. So if you've never used version control and you start using version control, that's a big step. If you've never used continuous integration and you start using continuous integration, that's a big step. Neither of those things are continuous delivery, but they are steps in the direction, and they are significant improvements in software development process and technology when you make those steps.
Okay, and do you have any particular things in mind when you talk about continuous integration for the database? I mean, what does that actually mean? We know what a software build is, but what does the database build actually mean in this context?
There's another good book called Refactoring for Databases, and a lot of my thinking about from a design and technical point of view is kind of influenced by the ideas in that by Pramod Savage and Scott Ambler, and that's about evolving, working with databases in a way that allows you to evolve them over time and to learn what works and what doesn't, and change the database. You're not kind of trying to invent one schema to rule them all and assume that that's going to be perfect forever, because in the world changes and we learn things, and we have to react to those as we move on. I'm sorry, I've waffled and I've lost the thread. Could you repeat the question? I've forgotten what you asked me.
Let's see, we were on the database continuous integration and what that actually means, because I'm not sure everybody's going to have a clear view of...
Yes. So one of the techniques that I've used in the projects that I've worked on successfully is to look at the database as a software platform. So think of it not so much in terms of its data storage, but it's a programming platform. We are encoding behaviors that we want our system to exhibit in production, and so coming at it as a software developer who's kind of infected with automated testing and test-driven development, I want to use those powerful tools when I'm using that programming platform, as well as when I'm using a more conventional programming language like C++ or Java or whatever. So if I think of it that way, then the things that I want to test are the changes in the behavior that I'm trying to deliver. So, for example, the refactoring for databases will tell me to work in small chunks and to create delta migrations of the behavior of my database. And so I will want to test that those migrations do what I want them to, that they migrate the data or the behavior of the system in the way that I behave. So I'm not really interested in testing the database that the data is right. I'm interested in testing the behaviors that I'm encoding to make sure that the data is right, if you see what I mean. It's a slightly different take on going in. My experience with working that way is that you're able to both work iteratively and incrementally, but also you get the benefits of this kind of test-driven approach. There are some complexities that make it a little bit trickier to do that kind of test-driven database development than it is for other programming languages, but it's absolutely feasible, and in my experience it certainly works.
Okay, well, can you talk about some of those complexities and how somebody might overcome them? Because again, I think it might be just a mystery to a lot of people.
Sure. So one of the difficulties that I've seen a couple of times is there's kind of an awkward position in terms of being able to get the data. I don't know how well I can explain this without complicated pictures and so on. But there's kind of a what I've found is that you get to this position where you want to express a test, and you want to migrate. You want to have a known good starting point, and then you want to apply a series of deltas. Periodically, you want to roll up and you want to re-establish a baseline so that you can kind of just manage this. You can kind of keep this incremental development. And as I said, the Refactoring for Databases book kind of talks about these kind of strategies and approaches to managing change in databases. If you want to be able to test those things, though, it can be difficult sometimes to get the data into the right state in step with the change and coordinating that. And so typically if you think about the way in which you run tests, what you usually do is that you in test-driven development is that you'll run all of it. You'll write some new tests, and then you'll deploy some software, and then you'll run all of the tests in a batch. And for database migrations, if you're doing the delta thing, then you've got to be more incremental about that. You've got to make sure that you're writing them in the correct sequences, because the deltas build on top of one another. And so it's not quite the same. You've not got kind of one version and then you run all the tests. You've got to run the test and then do the next deployment, and then run another test and do the next deployment, and then run another test and do the next deployment, if you're using this delta pattern to migrate a database. And so there's a slight, it's not terribly hard, but if you don't think about it that way, it's quite hard to see how not to tie yourself in knots about that. So following the pattern and making sure that you do the deltas, run the test for that delta, and then move on to the next delta, and then run the test for that delta, is kind of one of those tricks that I would recommend people try.
And are you doing this on real data that you've brought back from production? Are you doing this just on seed data that you've put in? How are you dealing with data as you're going through this process?
Mostly for this kind of test, we'll be using this on a lightweight set of data that we construct just to support the test. We want to avoid the use of production data because we want to be able to test. We want to be able to test at the edges of the behavior of our system. We want to be able to stress our changes, and production data may not necessarily do that. It may be just the normal, run-of-the-mill stuff. There is a role for testing with production data, but this isn't it. For these kinds of tests, we're trying to explicitly use the minimum amount of behavior and data and test code in order to evaluate that our change is good. And so we're trying to minimize the tests.
Where do you go on and get that kind of realistic production-like testing then? So in the CI process, you do your seeds and your unit test style things on those migrations. Where do you actually bring the more complex, or not necessarily more complex, but the realistic cases in?
So let's go back to talking about a deployment pipeline again. So we talked about wanting to do a series of evaluations, and we're going to stage these through. And as we go, as our release candidate progresses through the deployment pipeline, we're going to be increasing confidence that it's good and it's going to be releasable into production. As we near the end of the pipeline and get closer to the point of release into production, we'll have evaluated it for does it do what the developers think it should do? Does it do what the users want it to do? Does it perform as it should? Does it meet our usability criteria? Does it deploy successfully? All of these sorts of things we'll know by the time it gets close to the end of releasability into production. But one of the things that we won't necessarily know is, will this version of the software migrate the data that I have in production and still be in a working state after it's done that? So that's a good test to carry out kind of as you're on the verge of production. So at LMAX, for example, one of the tests that we had was what we called it a staging test. And what would happen was that every day our automated systems would take a cut of production data, and because this was a finance company, we would anonymize that data and we would bring that into our test environment. As release for that, and we would use that cut of the data for all of our testing for that day. As release candidates came through our pipeline to the appropriate point, we would deploy them using our automated deployment tools, using that anonymized production data, and our migration, as part of our deployment, our migration tools would migrate the data to its new state, adding these deltas that we've been talking about, migrating bit by bit and so on. And then we'd run a series of automated high-level tests that would evaluate that the principal use cases of our system still functioned and the system still looked healthy. So that's a good use case for using realistic production data.
Okay.
The difficulty with production data is it's vast. It can be vast. And so, it's unwieldy. You don't really want to be shifting this around, and you can have privacy concerns and so on. So, and also, as I said, it doesn't necessarily give you all of the corner cases. I want to be able to test things, as though the system was under severe stress, or as though something crazy had happened. And just a cut of production data doesn't give me that.
Well, one question that a number of our users, or a number of the people on the call have had is about how you set up that data quickly and spin up those environments quickly, whether you have any particular techniques for doing that.
Yeah, so generally what I've seen in several different organizations now is that we kind of think of two cases in terms of deploying the database. The first is kind of the initialization case. You're coming to deploy to an environment that has never had a database deployed. It doesn't have a database already deployed there. And so you can kind of just blow everything away. You can just kind of automate the deployment of the RDBMS system. You can configure that with new schemas, any scripts that you've got version controls. You play your deltas to get it up to date to a state that makes sense, and then you're ready to go. The other case that's important is where there is already data there, and of course you don't want to delete that data and start afresh. So the pattern that kind of works in both of those cases is this idea of you kind of have a baseline version of your software. So there's a set of scripts that when you run them, they will get your database into a known state. Generally, as part of the automated process to establishing that state, what I've done is that would also involve some basic common test data that just kind of puts enough data, reference data, that kind of thing in place that's going to be useful for tests. Mostly, I want my tests to create the data they need through natural interactions with the systems that are under test, rather than populating the database directly. But there are some initialization of data that can be useful at this stage, and that can be a subset that you just that you just configure and pick up depending on the environment in which you're deploying that. So that subset might be a simpler subset in a QA person's test environment compared to the performance test environment, and it's certainly going to be a simpler subset than when you get to production. And you just, at deployment time, you pick which version of that subset of data you want. Then on top of that, in the database, there'll be a table that is a version table, and that will say, I'm at, for want of a better term, patch level 5, okay? And the software comes along, it needs to be deployed, and it requires patch level 10. So it's now got 5 deltas to apply to get to that position. The deployment tools will then pick each of those numbered deltas and apply them, and as it does, it will update the version table to say what version the database is at. And then, next time you release, you can look at which deltas need to be picked up in order to move the database forward to its particular revision. You can also use a strategy of being able to roll back using that technique as well. So you make it part of your development process that you always write a roll forward script and a roll back script, and then you can deploy the system to any state, and you can migrate the data forwards or backwards.
Well, that's exactly what Pedro Lopez wanted to ask about, whether you always roll forward with continuous delivery or whether you do actually do those rollback scripts, and if so, how do you do that without losing customer data?
So I've done both of those, and you can't do the rollback thing without necessarily losing customer data. That's a decision that you take if you roll back. That's a case that might be possible. In general, my experience has been that as a team, as you get more and more sophisticated with this stuff, you tend to drop the rollback stuff because you get so good at releasing and rolling forward that if a problem occurs, you'll just fix the problem and roll forward again. And as a team, you'll prefer to do that. And I've seen kind of 5 or 6 teams make that transition. But I would definitely recommend being conservative, of your data and thinking about doing the rollback scripts initially as you're applying this delta policy, if only to make sure that you feel comfortable with it. But on the whole, I think it's a transitional state. I think that where most teams end up is that they drop the rollback scripts and just roll forwards.
Okay. Let's pick on that for a second, because I've kind of let this slide for a long time. We've been talking about the Delta approach and the migration-based approach for everything so far. But, for example, Sandor Pak is asking, what about tools like SQL Deploy? So the Microsoft solution using database projects where there are no deltas, you're just carrying a current state of the database through the system. What about continuous delivery with a system like that?
So first, I'm not familiar with that technology. It's not something that I've used myself. I've tried the thing of doing the database. The difficulty with that, the difficulty for me is that I don't think that you can. I don't know how you version that properly, and I don't know how you manage the changes. Changes are naturally kind of deltas. They're increments on top of one another. And if you're not providing that that mechanism, for me, I'm not quite sure how you can do that and retain incrementalism and version control. So I can imagine ways in which you can kind of do the version control. In some ways, I guess this is similar to kind of Docker, where you kind of have a big image and you just kind of release a version of that image, and that's doable. I've certainly done that with other technologies. For the database, it feels like usually a more intimate relationship in the system between the database and the applications that use it. And if I'm doing it that way, I'd rather be able to make smaller changes, because that always feels less risky to me. Right. Having a big change feels like a riskier thing.
Okay, I mean, we have Sandor Pak suggesting ways in the background, so I want to give you your due about, use your version control system, version database as a project. And I think there are ways, and I certainly have seen it happen, but often users have needed to build something on top of the native tools to assist with the visibility of those changes, what that means.
So I have definitely done this with other kinds of software. So this is a strategy that I've often used, where you've got kind of some third-party component that's part of it. System, and sometimes those are significant components. But for the database, where you've usually got a reasonably a relatively tight coupling between the applications that run on top of it and the database itself, that doesn't seem like the best strategy to me. It doesn't seem to enable this kind of incremental way of working to me.
Okay. Well, we've been talking about the kind of incremental changes to schema, to the parts that have a state in, the parts that are holding data. We haven't talked about things like stored procedures or functions or something in there which is actually doing some logic and that aspect of it. I mean, is that treated differently? Is that treated the same in your model?
So first, I think that it's fair to say that as an architectural style, the projects that I've worked on have been relatively stored procedures, not massively heavy users of stored procedures. So certainly we use stored procedures for all sorts of things, but there wasn't lots of behavior in stored procedures. So I'm just trying to put my caveats out there that I'm not a stored procedure expert.
Okay.
Having said that, philosophically, it's code like any other code, and from a continuous delivery philosophy stance, I want to evaluate any changes that I make to that code in the same way that I would any other. And so, if the database itself is not giving me, and most of them don't, as far as I'm aware, doesn't give me any versioning behavior, I'm going to move the source code for my stored procedures somewhere else so that I can version them. So I will put them in a traditional version control system and automate the deployment of those scripts to populate the stored procedures. I also will want to be able to deploy those in the test environment so that I can run unit tests against them, and I can evaluate the behaviors of the stored procedures. And I will write my stored procedures in a modular way so that they are testable. Again, as I said before, the technologies are, in some languages make it easier to do that kind of thing than perhaps it is for stored procedures. But for me, the value that I get out of working that way is so enormous that I would work quite hard to try and get to a way of working that would allow me to have that automation and that automated testing and version control of my stored procedures as a normal part of my process. Okay. And on the projects where I have worked on, despite them being lightweight in stored procedures, that's what we've done.
We had an interesting question from Patrick about, can you succeed starting continuous delivery with the database as opposed to starting with on the software side first? So does it make sense to...
That is a really interesting question, and I haven't seen anybody do it that way. In part, this might be a philosophical thing. I can't honestly see a reason why not. I can't see why you couldn't do it starting with the database. But in general, mostly continuous delivery is kind of, as I said at the outset, what we're trying to do is we're trying to optimize from having an idea at the level of the business and getting that in the hands of users in the form of working software. And a database is a component of that. And so I think usually most organizations that are trying to apply this are approaching it more holistically. So they're thinking more about how to deliver this feature to a user efficiently and quickly. And it's us techies that worry about the quality of our database and so on. Users don't care about the database as such, other than as a means to getting towards the feature. So you'd want to be thinking about all of the aspects of delivering the feature together and how to optimize all of that. So from a purist point of view, I'd want a more holistic view. So I wouldn't want to start either with the application or with the database. I'd want to look at them both together.
I think there's an interesting kind of implicit assumption here. I mean, it sounds, Dave, like you are saying that those teams have to work very closely together or possibly even be reconstituted so that they are one team. Yes. Again, does that mean that in a traditional dev-DBA split that there can be no continuous delivery?
As I've said before, this is a journey. There are steps and there's value all along the way, and different organizations start at different points. I think that the destination is as you describe. Organizations that embrace this stuff don't have those kinds of team barriers. Look at the way in which Spotify or Amazon organize themselves, and their teams are responsible for everything about their system. They're responsible for the profitability of it, the business level ideas, the technology, the operation of it in production, and the databases as well as everything else. Now, that doesn't mean that people don't have specialist skills and contribute in different ways, but they're all looking at it and aiming for delivering the same value, and that is delivering working software to users as efficiently as possible. So the end game, I think, breaks down those barriers, and this is one of the challenges that we talked about before, from an organizational point of view. This challenges traditional organizational structures to work in that way. That doesn't mean that everybody that starts on the journey to adopting continuous delivery does that first. But I think over time that will become something that makes you go slower and less efficiently, and will get weeded out as a result.
Right, but as you've already said, you do believe that the teams can still get a lot of benefit by adopting these processes even locally for the fast feedback, for the better quality, yes, for the higher delivery rates.
Yes.
Yeah. I noticed there are quite a few data warehousing questions, and so I want to take a little bit of time talking about that specific type of application. Is that something that you can comment on about, how you bring things like your reporting or your, in this case we have people asking about SSIS packages into a CD pipeline?
Yeah. So my experience is limited to kind of 3 or 4 projects that I've worked on where I've been anywhere close to that stuff. So not vast experience, but again, in those projects, we didn't treat it any differently. We didn't treat the data warehouse any differently to any other aspect of our system. So it was part of the deployment pipeline. It was migrated using Delta scripts. Those Delta scripts were tested in the same way, and they would be version controlled alongside the Delta scripts for database changes that were that were providing the data that was going to the data warehouse. Mm-hmm. So the philosophy, I don't think, changes. Where the challenges come in are, I'm trying to figure out how to say this and not offend our listeners. But in organisations that have organisational structures that aren't really amenable to working this way. So if you've got a separate data warehouse team and a separate, a distinct data warehouse that's being fed by different projects, different databases, then it can be hard to coordinate this kind of thing. And my approach to tackling that problem was to start looking at the organisational barriers and the team structures and figuring out if there's another way in which we could organise that would allow us to manage these changes, to minimise dependencies between teams, and allow the flow of change in the way that I've described. But from a technical point of view, this is still about good version control, good continuous integration, pipeline automation, and
seems to have lost Dave for a second there.
No.
His picture is still there. Let's see. I was actually just going to lead into my next question about how to get management buy-in for this, and maybe some first steps to get started. Let's jump ahead and see if we can get Dave back, but it's actually getting close to wrapping up. So Elizabeth, do you want to talk a little bit about ReadyRoll?
Yeah, I'd love to. I just wanted to let people know that this existed, really, because this is a new direction for Redgate. It's something that we took a very serious look at after talking to people like Dave Farley, who, as you know, really seriously espoused this script-based and migration-based approach for making your database changes. And I guess we took a look at that very seriously and realized that, yes, that it can be a very good basis for constructing your continuous delivery process, but it brought its own challenges, in particular constructing those scripts in the first place, because that may or may not be something that you have the expertise on your team to do, and secondly about how you manage the proliferation of those things and get them through your pipeline. So this is a tool that we have brought into Redgate now and are very actively developing. And what it will do for you is it will sit in Visual Studio, it will help you generate the scripts, and it then will it has deployment pieces that you can plug into your continuous integration or deployment management systems to help you get your your script-based process, help you take your scripts through a continuous delivery process. So, like I say, we just wanted to let you know that this exists and was very much influenced by the ideas that Dave is saying today about taking small batches of work all the way through a delivery pipeline and keeping things always releasable, rather than what we used to see about very large traditional big bang deployments, about taking them and kind of reconstituting teams, especially in the end game, so that you have all those database skills present early in the development process and can then use your testing procedures as a proper rehearsal for production.
And these are those Delta scripts that Dave was talking about.
That's right. It takes a Delta script-based approach. So instead of that kind of state-based, like Microsoft's database projects approach, it takes an approach based on those Delta scripts. But of course, I think many people have a bad view of that from having used those in the dark ages. And I guess the point is that once you have some tooling to help you manage that, suddenly it becomes a very effective process, a highly visible process about exactly what changes are being made throughout the system. And some of the downsides of doing this before, where people used to be emailing around scripts for approval, well, now we've got systems in place, CI systems, we've got release management systems, and with all of these things, plus something that helps you manage the proliferation of scripts in particular, you get a very effective solution for actually rolling out your database changes in the same way you would roll out your application changes, and doing it from an environment that you're used to working in as an application developer.
And that's some of the good questions that we got during the registrations for this. People were looking for advice from Dave on what kind of tools he could recommend to help with CD. And there are also some good questions coming in about actually the next step. So once you're doing CD, what about deployment? So if we can't get Dave back on the line, we will be following up with a blog post that takes all these questions, and we'll send around the link to that when that's ready. If you guys have any questions that haven't been answered during the workshop, feel free to email us at dlm@redgate.com. We also wanted to let you know about the Database Lifecycle Management book. So this is a book that we're writing in a lean way, publishing chapter by chapter on Database Lifecycle Management, which talks about how to version control your database, how to get that set up in your CI process and automate the testing of that, and into an automated release process, and all the structural and team changes that go along with that. If you guys have time, check out the www.redgate.com products/DLM for more information on articles about database lifecycle management, webinars. Our past webinars are posted there, and also a free trial of any of the Redgate tools, including the ReadyRoll, which I saw was a 30-day free trial. Is that right?
Yes, that's right.
Great.
So Stephanie, I'm just wondering, I know I hate to interrupt you, but I am wondering, there were a lot of outstanding questions. Are we going to be able to answer those after the webinar and get Dave back on to run through some of those that people didn't get answered in the course of it?
Yes, we had talked to Dave about following up with questions afterwards. So we can follow up with a blog post of any unanswered questions, and we'll send around the link to all the registered attendees along with the recording to this webinar.
That's really helpful. Thanks, Stephanie. Sorry, please.
The last link on that resources is information about our training and consulting. So in addition to the Redgate products, we also have one-day training on each of the courses: database source control, database continuous integration, which covers builds and testing, and finally automating database deployments. And follow us on Twitter at Redgate. And I'm going to jump back to the slide with Elizabeth's contact information, so you can have her Twitter address as well. And then I'll also jump to Dave's slide and that's his Twitter address as well. So unfortunately, it doesn't seem like Dave's been able to get back on, but we are kind of at the end of our time anyway. So any final thoughts, Elizabeth, on your takeaway from the discussion with Dave today?
Well, I always enjoy having a talk with Dave about how people actually get started, and I think that, listening to him talk about it, it's great to hear about the end state and what we can all aim for, but I guess one of the takeaways for me is always that even a small step can give you really great benefits. So, he's talking about having bigger and bigger, like, deployment loops, so that the biggest one is you have a business idea and you get, from one side and you get a feature out to a user, but on the smaller level where you have those tight loops of code and tests, I think seeing that actually improve people's processes even in a small way is probably one of the things which it can be very inspiring, that on a small scale we can still get some really huge benefits out of something like that. So I think that's one thing that I always try to remember, is that especially when it comes to the database, where nothing is going to move fast, especially organizationally, I was just trying to channel you, Dave, to talk about that message between the big changes at the organizational level, but also those small changes which still give those huge benefits, even just to teams, without having necessarily to have a sea change in your organization's culture, which I'm not sure everybody can count on, but they can make their own lives a lot better by some of these processes.
Yeah, the only way change happens is in small increments. The only way change happens is by somebody starting to try and make a difference, and things will happen. And sometimes they'll happen very slowly, but it's the only way change ever happens. I'm very sorry, I had a network glitch or something, but I don't know what quite happened there.
Well, we were kind of at the end of our hour. I want to thank you guys so much for being here today and for talking about this topic. And Dave, we let users know that we'll be following up with the questions that we didn't get to today through a blog post and sending that link around. So thank you again for offering to help out with that, with those questions afterwards. And yeah, we'll send you guys a link soon. And thanks for joining us today.
Great, thank you.
Thanks. Bye-bye, guys.
Bye.